I always think that is the sauce to be able to deal with insecurity. All right. Thanks for taking some time to check out the Devoted Life podcast. This is episode 5 of year 1, and we're having a lot of fun so far. And so listen, if this has been helpful, I encourage you to check out past episodes, and you can like, subscribe, help us get the word out, help us reach more people and make a bigger impact. This is going to be a really special episode. It might even be the best episode so far. And so I'm Justin Kendrick, grateful to be with you and to get a little bit of time with you today. I want to talk about, why is everyone blowing up their life? Why do we hear so much right now about exhaustion, about burnout, about dysfunctional life patterns and life rhythms? Recently, I was reading a book by James Bryan Smith. He says that the number one enemy to the spiritual life is exhaustion. And it seems like people are just exhausted physically, mentally, emotionally, both Christians and non-Christians. And so as a pastor, I get a front row seat to this. And I've also personally wrestled with, pace, rhythm. How do we stay healthy, whether you're in church ministry or whether you're a follower of Christ out in the marketplace and in the world? And I feel like a lot of people are feeling the exhaustion and the pressure and the dysfunction of our routines. It feels like maybe in some ways we're using an old frame, or in Jesus' words, an old wineskin, to try to manage a new wine, a new world, that some of the assumptions of 20, 30, 40 years ago, they're just not the same in the technical age that we're living in. And so it feels like people are often falling into one of a few categories, right? Some people are just existing. They're not really thriving. They're just existing. It's like, so how are you? Well, I'm a constant C plus. I'm not like absolutely losing my mind, but I'm not maximizing my life. Some people are, it seems, just blaming. Like there's always somebody to blame. It's my wife's fault. It's my husband's fault. It's my boss's fault. It's my dog's fault. It's someone's fault that I'm not happy or that I'm not functional. And so that's where some people are. And then I'm seeing just a ton of people kind of giving up. They're calling it quiet quitting, where it's like, I quit, but I didn't actually quit. I'm just not giving my best anymore. But that's not just in the work world. That's on friendships. That's on marriages. That's on church, right? People just sort of giving up, walking away from community, and really, really losing their zeal and their passion and their focus in life. And so I think that, one of the biggest observations I've seen as I've looked at this and reflected on this over the last number of years is that it seems to be a pattern that my inner life doesn't have the infrastructure to support my outer life, that the things that the world is demanding of me, I don't actually have the internal framework to healthily manage long term. And so it's just catching up to us. And by the way, this coming September 2024, I've got a book coming out called How to Quiet a Hurricane that actually deals a lot with this issue and how we manage the tensions and the pressures of the world we're living in. We'll get into that in future episodes. But today, friends, I am honored to have one of the greatest minds on earth with us here today. Joining us on a call is the great Lance Witt. And so if you don't know Lance, Lance is a legend. He has served in ministry in so many different spheres. He's been a senior pastor. He was an executive pastor at Saddleback with Rick Warren. He currently leads a ministry called Replenish, which is helping thousands of leaders stay healthy and high performing. He's written a number of incredible books. He wrote a book called Replenish, High Impact Teams, Your One Life. I encourage you, go out and buy them all. They are really, really good. And Lance is a dear friend and a mentor in my life. And I can't speak highly enough of you, Lance. So thanks for hanging out with us for a little while today. Grateful to have you.
Thank you, Justin. That is a very kind and probably overstated introduction, but I appreciate that, and thank you for your kind words.
Yeah, that's understated for sure. It is. Well, listen, you have taught me a lot in this area, and you get to interact with a lot of church leaders all across America and all over the world, and you teach a lot of spiritual practices. You help people diagnose some of the dysfunction and you've seen both church leaders and followers of Christ, and then society in general. I would say that you really have a unique perspective as an expert in helping people diagnose the deeper issues. And so I would love to just hear off the top, as you think about burnout in particular, and it seems sort of like an epidemic of burnout. What do you see as some of the factors sort of fueling this when you talk to leaders and followers of Christ across the country?
Yeah, first, I just want to sort of validate, I think, what you're sensing and what you see in New England. I feel like I'm
Yeah.
seeing across the country, churches, big, small, rural, urban, what leaders are facing. And so there's a lot more talk today about mental health, about soul care, about the inner life that I've ever seen, certainly in my lifetime. And I do think that leading in the church has become more complex. Like you
Yeah.
said, the assumptions we operated off of 20 years ago just don't work today. And I think it takes a new level of courage
Mm.
to lead today that wasn't required even 5 years ago.
Yeah.
But
Wow.
I'd also make this comment, maybe a little bit of an insight. I don't think the issues are primarily around the amount of work that people are doing. And I think we tend to slap the label burnout over it.
Yeah.
And at least a decade ago, 20 years ago, we would go, okay, that's because people have been pushing too hard,
Volume.
overly driven, exhausted from being a workaholic. And I think today that's not the core issue. I
Mm.
think it's more around the kind of work, the level of intensity, the complexity of navigating all the cultural issues and the nuances of that. And so it's not classic burnout from workaholism. It's something a little bit different. And I think, honestly, Justin, we have lived in a bubble for a really long time
Yeah.
where the cultural values mirrored the values of the church for many decades and
Sure.
even a couple of generations. But we're just beginning to experience, I think, what has been the norm for the Christian church throughout the history of the church. And that is that life is hard and leadership is hard, and we should actually expect hard. I was
Yes.
think about
Good.
First Thessalonians when Paul says that he sent Timothy to these early Christians to keep them from being shaken by the hardship they were going through. And then he gives us this thought. He says, but you know that we're actually destined for such troubles. Like,
Yeah.
it shouldn't surprise us or catch us off guard that ministry is complex and hard. And we're
Yeah.
living in what has been the norm for most Christians living around the world for generations.
Yeah, it's so good. This last week I mentioned, in my sermon, the Jefferson Bible, where Thomas Jefferson, went through with a pair of scissors and actually cut out all the things he didn't agree with in the New Testament. And I think that for a long time, obviously Christians today maybe aren't doing that. But what we are doing is we've been cutting out for the last 25, 30 years, especially all the things it says about suffering and hardship and sorrow and pain, like literally just reading past them so that we have a Bible where we are now our expectation is like, well, Jesus blesses me and keeps me healthy and gives me everything I need. And that's my expectation. And then when that doesn't happen, there's this really kind of like crumbling, this inner crumbling. But I think what you said about the insight around volume is not the root issue. That is such a helpful insight, because I think a lot of people, they go, hey, I just need to change the amount I'm doing and that's going to fix me. And then they do that and it doesn't fix them. Right. And so it's like, this is where a lot of us get stuck.
Yeah, and I think we have to develop some new practices and reframing our current reality, because we aren't living in that bubble anymore. And
Right.
the things that worked for us when we lived in the bubble don't work anymore. And so I
Yep.
need some new ways of thinking, some new ways of acting if I'm going to actually have a thriving life and not just exist and not just give up.
Yeah. Wow, that's so good. I know for me, as I've tried to examine my own internal infrastructure, it has been a long road of self-awareness. And you and I have talked about this a lot. And I would love for you to just share a little bit of your experience, because we can't diagnose what we can't see, right? And a lot of times what people will say, well, I'm having this issue with my spouse, or I'm having this issue of just physical illness, or I'm having this issue of I can't sleep and there's anxiety. And sometimes it's just a purely physical problem, of course, and we're for all the medical benefits and opportunities we have to learn and grow. But a lot of times it's a deeper issue of self-awareness where I don't realize that some of my habits are perpetuating my burnout or my dysfunction. Give us a glimpse of maybe your story and how we can grow as a in self-awareness as a follower of Jesus. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, first off, I would just say, wow, I'm going to have to give you a very abbreviated version of my own journey. But I think my journey's not unlike a lot of other Christian leaders. I
Yeah.
would say, one, as I go back to my early days becoming a Christ follower, I would describe my churches and people around me, their attempt to disciple me, as mostly behavior modification.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
stop doing all the wrong stuff called sin, start doing all the right things that
Yeah.
now good Christians do.
Right.
And there was a heavy emphasis on doing, right?
Yep.
And so there's no emphasis on being and the internal transformation and some of the long, hard work that God wants to do to sort of reorient my internal narrative and
Yeah.
how I naturally think about myself. And I have this story I tell sometimes when I'm speaking about a guy that had been on my staff many years ago, and he was coming through town and wanted to have lunch. And so we got together to have lunch. We reminisced, told a bunch of old funny stories. And then at one point in our lunch conversation, he just stopped and he just paused. And he said, there's always something I've wanted to say to you. And I remember internally thinking to myself, like, oh, crap,
Yeah,
this is
no,
not
no.
going to be good. And sure enough, the words that followed were these words: you weren't very easy to work for.
Mm,
And he began to outline some of the ways that my leadership had been hard and painful on him and the rest of the staff around me. And I remember walking away feeling like, wow, I had so little clue about self-awareness and
yes.
my emotional intelligence in those early years as a leader. And so for me, Justin, it's only been in the last 15 to 20 years that I think I would describe it like this. You have to become a student of your own soul
Mm,
and of your inner life,
yep.
and understanding what are the things that shaped you from your past that now are the default way of acting and thinking for yourself.
Yep.
So for me, it's been a hard journey really beginning to examine, like, who am I really?
Yep.
What are
Yep.
some of the whys behind why I act like I do? And beginning to be a student of my own soul. And that takes
Wow.
some time. And
Yeah.
I love this quote. It's not original with me, but I love it. It says, self awareness is your best defense against self deceit. And I feel
Yeah.
like for the last 20 years, I've been trying to peel back some of the layers so that I no longer live in self deceit. And for me, one of the big things, along with the internal introspection and letting God shine the spotlight on some broken things in me, but I've
Yep.
also had to learn to lean into feedback from other people
Ah, that's good. Yeah.
and to not let my insecurities and people pleasing cause me to become defensive or rationalize away, but actually sit and listen and go, what's the truth I need to hear in this?
Yeah. Yeah.
What are they saying? What's the last 10% they still haven't told me that I really need
Yeah.
to hear
Yep.
so that my self-awareness can grow? And so I think there's an internal journey with this in terms of your own work with the Holy Spirit. And then there's the external, like letting other people
Yeah.
help you grow in your self-awareness. And I promise you, it will test your insecurities.
Yes.
Really lean into that feedback.
I feel like, and I talk about this a lot, and I've lived this a lot personally. It's so compelling to me how the gospel sets us up to be able to do this. Because, at its core, the gospel says you're far more sinful than you think, right? Which
Right?
is crushing, right? Because it's like we all have this image of ourselves that we're trying to prop up. No, I'm pretty good. No, I'm not that bad. Well, I'm not
Yeah.
as bad as that guy. And the gospel's like, no, everything you do is selfish. Everything you do is tainted. There's nothing that is redeemable in your own capacity or ability. And at the same time, you do not have to earn God's love and favor. He has poured it out on you through Christ. And by union with him, you are accepted, you are blameless, you are adopted, and you are loved. And so it's this collision of two psychological phenomena, my own exposure, which humbles me,
Right.
and then my own acceptance and affirmation, which gives me confidence. And I always think that is the sauce to be able to deal with insecurity, because now, like, I don't have to be perfect because I know I'm a sinner, but I also have the freedom to explore my issues because I know I'm loved,
Yeah.
and so to me, like, I know in my own journey, trying to become self-aware, the underpinning of that is the gospel that actually gives me the frame to be able to not be so insecure about my failures and flaws. Like, I know for me, and there's been a lot in self-awareness for me. I know, like, this one's an obvious one, but this is going to help somebody. And we've talked about this. For me, it's almost always physical signals first, right? Like,
Mhm.
everybody's heard it, that your body is a major prophet, not a minor prophet, and it's like headaches, I can't sleep, aches and pains. These are all, I know for me, like signals or signs that something's out of joint, that like there's probably a pace issue, there's probably a blind spot. And then I would say, I know in my own journey, people, you're one of them, for sure, in my life. My wife is one of them, where they see things I don't. And to me, like, I want to be a person, and I encourage everybody listening, take notes. Like, when you have someone who loves you confront you, don't come up with the 13 reasons why they're wrong. Like, just literally, like, write it down and reflect on it, because they see things that you don't see about yourself. And that is so humbling and so helpful.
Yeah, I'm reminded how often in Proverbs words like correction and rebuke and are seen as a gift.
Yes.
And again, it doesn't happen automatically or quickly, but over time, as you grow in self-awareness, you can begin to really, when you really take the gospel to heart that I'm
Yes.
desperately sinful, but I am deeply and unconditionally loved.
Yep.
Like over time, you can begin to receive that feedback in a healthy and helpful way.
Yeah. We did a podcast last month with Chrisy about relationship, and she told the story about how she was kind of throwing a little fit. And I just told her, like, you are a selfish person. And then, yeah, that goes great when you tell your wife that. And then I told the story about how she told me, you make me feel like your ministry is more important than mine.
Mm,
We talked about that when that happened, and that was a catalytic moment for me, where I saw something about myself that I just didn't see. And it was
yeah.
obviously embarrassing and humbling, and at the same time liberating, because I was like, wow, I can see it now. And now when I start to peel back the layers, I've been affirming that narrative in a lot of ways. And now I can undo it, and even just watching her over the last number of years thrive as I've been more aware of that narrative. Um, this is where other people can be so helpful in self-awareness, where
Yeah.
it's like, if you can listen, faithful are the wounds of a friend,
Yeah.
it really is true. But I want to talk a little bit about this idea of changing our minds, because, we all have these ideas that kind of get stuck in our thinking, and they become the engine of our own dysfunction. And so, talk to me about, in the leaders you've worked with, in the churches you've worked with, in your observations and in your own experience, what are some of the kind of the things that you've seen in terms of false narratives that people think, that usually lead to burnout, lead to exhaustion, lead to an internal fragility
Yeah.
in life?
And I think first off, just to accentuate, this is a huge issue. And I really believe that for a lot of people, the lid on their leadership is not their communication, it's not their strategic gifts. It really is this whole issue of the insecurity that they have and the
Mm,
sort of false narrative that leaks out. And again, let's just be clear, every false narrative I have, it's never stays internal. It
wow.
always leaks out in my marriage, in my
Yep.
friendships, in the team that I lead. And And so I do think most of us, our narratives are rooted in our family of origin.
Hmm.
And often they are around issues around shame, performance,
Yep.
perfectionism, the need to always be productive, to always have to be the biggest personality in the room. And so one of the things I do with leaders, Justin, is often we do this exercise, I call it the internal script. And
Uh,
we begin to try to identify, like for you, what's the one or two primary internal scripts, the false narrative, to use your language,
sure.
that just runs in the background for you,
Yep.
and actually to articulate it. And so
Yep.
like I've been able to go back and now know that I really picked this up a lot from my dad, who by the way was a great man.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
the internal narrative that I picked up was this: work hard, be responsible, achieve. That's how you succeed, and that's how
Mm.
you get loved.
Mm.
Well, when that's the script that is constantly running in the background and the filter through which you run everything in your life, you're only as good as your latest achievement.
Yeah.
And you have to project an image that is one of being successful and overworking and being overly responsible, that often in my life led to workaholism.
Yep.
And one of the things I'll say to people is some of the things that people will applaud in your life are actually the things that will wreck your soul.
Hmm. Wow.
And so I've had to identify, and I would just encourage every leader listening to spend the time to get alone with Jesus and to really articulate and write out, what is that primary script that tends
Wow.
to drive my life?
Yes.
And I think the first step in overcoming it is actually being able to articulate it and
Yes.
name it, call it what it is,
Yes.
and recognize it when it begins to creep up in your life.
Wow. Yeah, that is so helpful. You and I went through that exercise years ago, and it was pretty devastating in a wonderful way. I
Yeah.
think one of the ones that I had to confront was just this idea that like limits don't apply to me. And I wouldn't have said that out loud, but that's how I lived. I lived with this whole idea that like limits are for the weak,
Yeah.
and I don't have limits on my capacity. I don't have limits on my time. And that was driving a lot of like I thought, yeah, if you're gonna let yourself be limited, I used to always say, things like, ah, well, you sleep when you're dead, kind of things. And it was
Right.
like that was like that was like a badge of honor, and
Mhm.
we talked about this many times, but what I didn't realize is that that's actually an attempt to be God.
Yeah.
Like, to not overstate it, that is an attempt to grasp at divinity that does not belong to a human being, right? And so like God, creation, there's a narrative around cadence and limit and rest. And so God says, no, it's evening and it's morning. And then there's a
Right.
seventh day, and all of these cues towards limits. And I had to realize that you're not just being unrealistic about your expectations. You're actually fighting against God and trying to take his seat. It's like back to the garden. And so when I actually saw that narrative, it was crushing because I realized, wow, that's fueling a lot of my unwillingness to stop. And then you pair that with like one you mentioned, I am what I produce,
Yeah.
which is kind of the narrative of our modern era, that like you're only as good as what you accomplish. And so those two together, limits are bad, I am what I produce, boy, that leads to cancer in the soul.
Yeah. And I think, for me, one of the biggest ahas or epiphanies was realizing that a lot of times those things served me really well, that false narrative, because it
That's
would
right.
drive me to be a
That's right.
producer, right? To live often beyond my limits. And people would pat me on the back and go, man, give it to Lance. He'll get it done. Like
That's
he's
right.
a
Yep.
go-getter. And that was fueling and feeding something very unhealthy in me.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I know. You become dependent on the false
Yeah.
narrative, and then you're scared, if I let it go, do I lose
Yeah.
my space, my
Yep.
platform, my yeah.
Yes.
It's huge. Tell me about, so we've talked a lot about spiritual practices, and in your own life, I want to just bounce around, routines or disciplines that have helped you cultivate a thriving inner life. And
Mm.
so if we're going to undo some of the dysfunction that I think culturally is perpetuated, what are some of the tools in the tool belt that we can actually begin to use to change the direction and shift things? What comes to mind?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is I feel like I need to be honest and say, these are still a work of progress in my life. Like these are not things I've mastered. I'm sitting here with you today. I'm thinking I'm 65 years old and I still really struggle with some of this stuff. And so I wouldn't want anyone to walk away and go like, like, man, I'll be at some point where I'm going to finally have just mastered all of this. And
Yeah.
I still feel like I'm sharing with you some things that are helping me, not that I've completely figured out. So a
Yeah, it's
couple
good.
of things, and this one is just, it sounds simple, but gosh, it's
Yeah.
been a challenge. And that is to literally, physically, actually slow yourself down. Like
Mm.
slow down how fast you walk, slow down how fast you drive, slow down
Whoa,
in a
whoa, whoa. I live in New
conversation.
England, not drive. Let's leave driving out of this.
Okay, yeah, we'll give you a free pass on that one,
Okay. All right.
but as a person who lives with a mind and a spirit that is constantly restless and pushing,
Yes.
to work to slow down to like actually be present in a conversation with my granddaughter
Mm.
or to linger over scripture and just slow down.
Yeah.
Like there's been something about slowing down that has works against my very nature, but has been so incredibly helpful. And Justin, this is a daily, sometimes hourly battle for me to still
Mm.
do this,
Yep.
to not move ahead too fast or move past something or move past that person that God may want me to see. So just slowing down. I think another one for me has been the whole issue of like learning to practice Sabbath and
Yeah.
to embrace rest. And I love in Deuteronomy 5 when God is reiterating the 10 commandments again, when he talks about Sabbath, he doesn't anchor it in creation. In Deuteronomy 5, he says, hey, you guys used to be slaves in Egypt, so now practice Sabbath. And you go, what?
Mm.
Like
Okay.
in
Yeah.
Egypt, all you did was work all the time. There was no time off, no rest. And God was saying, but now that you're no longer under the tyranny of Pharaoh, but you're under my leadership, God was saying, my people rest and
Wow.
stop and pause. And for me, one of the biggest things that's been helpful is like to go, Lance, you are not, your value and significance is not just in what you produce, that God loves you just the same when you're doing nothing
Wow.
or taking a nap on a Sabbath as he
Yes.
does when you're preaching to a big crowd. Like to really believe that and get that in my soul. Oh my gosh, that has been
Wow.
a challenge.
I remember
Um,
when you gave me that book on sleep, why we
yeah,
sleep, and I was like, sleep. And since that was probably a couple years ago, since internalizing some of that information, like I went from like how little sleep can I get and still
yeah,
function to how much sleep can I get. And now like my goal is 8 hours every night, which I don't
yeah,
always get with four kids, but the health benefits, the mental clarity, the spiritual focus, like all the benefits of actually, leaning into rest rather than always resisting and maximizing, your physical capacity. Um, there really is a cost benefit analysis that a lot of people
yeah,
never discover that like there are moments where less is more. There are
yeah.
moments where slower is faster, and that is highly underestimated. That's really good.
And I think go to the Gospels and just sort of examine the way that Jesus lived. Now, again, slow
Yeah.
was more naturally built into his culture than it is ours. So one,
Yes.
we're already at a disadvantage, but even in his slower culture, he still regularly took time
Mm.
to rest, to pull away from the crowd. He didn't meet every need. He didn't, heal every person. He didn't preach 24/7. No, he actually modeled for us a way of living that was really helpful. Another practice for me has been sort of this issue of silence and solitude, just learning
Yes.
how to be quiet. I think in our day, one of the hard things is not filling every second with noise
Mm.
and with clutter.
Yep.
And I think God speaks to me sometimes most deeply, most profoundly when I'm actually still enough, long enough, and quiet enough to actually for him to have my attention.
Yeah.
And so those have not been easy things to cultivate, but I'm in this journey of learning how to be quiet, to sit in silence. And I remember when I first started practicing this, like literally a minute of silence felt like 25 minutes. It was
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
hard. And my mind just wants to race ahead to all the stuff I need to be doing right now. And I feel like I feel like I'm that toddler that God has put in timeout and says, just be still,
Oh, it's so good. Yeah.
just
That is
sit.
so good.
So anyway, those are a few things that have been helping me in this journey.
Yeah, that's great. And I just encourage everybody that's listening, listen, it's nice to hear about these things. And maybe you've heard about them before, but blessed is the one who does it. I just want to
Yeah.
encourage you, literally set a timer, 5 minutes, be silent. I try to do this at least once a day where I'm just actually setting a timer and being silent. It is the benefits to the clarity, to the ability to focus, have been exponential for me. And I think it's all about dialing in to what God is saying and to what your own heart is saying. Because a lot of times our speed, and we didn't even talk about technology, the constant
Right.
entertainment. I can't sit in the car without turning something on,
Yeah.
radio or TV, whatever, or whatever. Hopefully not the TV when you're driving, but we've all done it. Right. But just actually like all the entertainment mechanisms that you're doing, even when you're driving or when you're traveling, like, what about just a little bit of space to be still? I think creating those gaps and creating that cadence. I know for me, I'm still, a freshman here, but I'm trying to integrate these more, and I'm seeing the benefits in every area of my life. I'm a better dad. I have better health. I'm a better husband. I'm more dialed into the people around me, and I got a lot of growing to do. So these are super super helpful tips, and I think those are good places to start for people. Just when it comes to, hey, set aside a 24-hour period to pause, pray, and play. Buy Lance's book, Replenish, and actually get daily input as to how do I replenish my soul, start practicing these things little by little. And then, obviously our American way, why didn't it fix me in a week? It's like, well, no, give it a year
Yeah.
and watch what God will do. Closing thoughts. What do you want to say to that person, maybe who, if they're honest, they're not super intentional about their inner life, and maybe they can take one step? What would you encourage them with?
Gosh. Again, I would go back to that two-word phrase of just slow down, take a breath, literally walk slower, put down your phone when you're having a conversation with your kid.
Mm,
Um, do a minute of silence as part of your quiet time in the morning, like just slow begin. And I would say, Justin, when I came out of my experience at Saddleback, which was a jet fuel drinking environment,
yes, yes.
and when I started to try to practice this stuff, I actually hated it because
Mm,
I had such a restlessness and a freneticness in my spirit that I didn't know how to just stop.
mm,
And and then I would just say, start to become a student of your own soul. Like,
mm.
do a genogram and begin to understand your family of origin and the way that that has shaped you, and begin to read books that help you understand your inner life, like
Yeah.
John Ortberg's book called Soul Keeping, a really
Yes.
good basic understanding of the soul and how we don't just have a soul, but it actually needs our attention and needs
Yeah.
to be managed. And or I'm sorry, Alicia Britt Jolie book
Yes.
Anonymous, or
Yes.
Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer. Like,
Yes.
start to feed on things that are good for your soul, not just good for your mind and good for your leadership.
Yeah. Wow. So good. Yeah, that's a gift. Lance, thanks. Thanks for your wisdom. Just a gift to me in my life in a trillion ways. That's not an overstatement.
Right.
And then to so many others as well. Hey, friends, thanks for sticking with us. Thanks for being a part of this podcast. If this has been a blessing to you, I encourage you, share it, like it, help us to get the word out, reach more people. Listen, if we can just push you one step further to a devoted life, one step closer to making everything in your world about Jesus, not about productivity, not about execution, not about your own personal version of success, but really driving you to a life that is devoted on Jesus. I am telling you, you will Never regret it. We'll see you next month.